and as a way to recalibrate the way we build for the regenerative age. The bold statement that we started from was we can do better than just less bad buildings. And I think this applies to other fields as well. We do in this presentation talk about architecture because this is the place that we start from, but we'd love to see how these lenses that we talk about and explored in these conversations together apply to other regenerative endeavors in general. Listening is always a good first step. And there are a couple of things that we need to sort of think about when listening. Context is one of the starting points of any project. Nature is the driving force and the inspiration of any project. And the complexity of nature, of course, is best understood using systems thinking and complexity tools rather than linear ones. Listening is very important, but we'd like to explore listening to what? There's a lot of layers that you can use to listen to a place. And we're going to go through some of them together. This is not an exhaustive list. It is a starting point for conversation. All of these layers that we're going to go through can be seen in the context of the different scales. This is a chart that is being used by the ETH Zurich Systems Design Lab, which has a wonderful course from sustainability to regeneration. And so you can listen to a place from the chemistry level all the way to the bioregion and then the eco-region. All of these scales matter. And when you go through a place, you can be mindful of that. The starting point is how not to do it. It's a top-down approach, imposing the human will onto nature, seeing nature as a machine. That has been tried and it doesn't work. The second very natural layer of listening to a place for a project is what the law requires of you and what it lets you do. And we all know from the sustainability towards regeneration graph that we know and use, this barely one step above breaking the law place, where all the standard endeavors, plans, and projects happen. I am allowed to do this much. When you start to inquire a bit more on how to use a place better, you start understanding, as I have in my practice, that you can bring more efficiency to your building once you understand the way a site works. You can place your house better towards the sun, towards the winds, towards the elements, and that makes it more energy efficient. And here we have some examples, and I will let Carl take over.
Thanks, Joe. So this is an example of a well-placed house, but it's a drawing of a Socrates' house. At one level, this is a diagram that's very similar to what you see when you're looking at houses designed from the 1970s, passive solar. But the point is that these principles of orienting a house to the south or to the sun, the south if you're in the northern hemisphere, is the first step. Maybe the second step is to have a roof overhang that keeps the summer sun out to keep the house cooler in the summer. And thinking about the winds for cooling and keeping the winter winds out. So these ideas have been around forever. Quick note, this is one example of a series of projects that I've collected from the list of perhaps the best of the best energy efficient buildings out of 111 projects at the time on the Living Building Challenge website. 9 of them were better than 50% better than normal. 8 of those 9 incorporated the basic principles of passive solar, direct orientation, roof overhangs or architectural elements to keep the summer sun out, taking advantage of breezes for cooling. The one project that doesn't follow those rules is a building with no windows to do a seed library. So 100% of the buildings that are better than 50% better than normal all follow these simple principles.
Once you start to get a feel for listening to the elements of a site, you can zoom out a little bit more and discover the permaculture way of seeing a site. You can make sector maps, understand the wildlife corridors, the fire sectors of a site, where the hot wind blows in the summer and where the breezes, the icy winter winds come to you. And once you do that, you understand that the house is not the single most important thing on your site. All of that land is. And so you start to really get an appreciation for the site in the grander scheme. The ones who have been doing this forever, and arguably they're doing it much better than our analytical top-down approach, are the ones who have been building traditionally in a place. They have empirically, generation by generation, tried and tested and tweaked solutions that are specifically adapted to that particular place. They have listened to their land, the same land, generation after generation, and you cannot get better efficiency than that. Carl, if you want to say a word about explorations.
There's a few examples of vernacular climate-appropriate architecture from around the world. Wind catchers from India, wind cooling towers from ancient Persia. The oldest Persian wind cooling towers are 800 years old, but they've been building them for 3,000 years. But I want to just draw attention to the very American-looking thing from New Orleans. This is an example of vernacular architecture or climate-appropriate. The tall ceilings in an old house with the tall windows was the air conditioning system. So even this vernacular climate-appropriate architecture is built into cute Americana normal houses. Much to learn from indigenous wisdom with indigenous people. This is an extraordinary example. It's the Sun Dagger part of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, where across the world, indigenous people mark whether it's a handprint or a point on a rock face to indicate when the summer solstice. This is perhaps the most sophisticated one. It's 3 rocks leaned up against the mountain and a spiral cut into the rocks. This is, as archaeologists tell us, is the only example that tracks both the movement of the sun and the movement of the moon. So it's an extraordinary thing. It's called the Sun Dagger at Chaco Canyon. If people want to explore that more, it's an amazing example of the importance of tracking the seasons indigenous people had to, because they didn't have an air conditioning system to turn on.
Once you start to add these cultural elements of a place and its history into your listening, you start to get a feel for the culture of a place. This opens up a whole new dimension, especially when you try to bring a new element to the culture of a place. When you're making a project, you are changing, you are interjecting, you're communicating with the culture of that place. So understanding it is a very important step. And it also helps to get the community, the people who are there right now, on board. And of course, the Regenesis group has been doing this wonderful work and very hard work for a bunch of years now, bringing a place towards social cohesion, understanding what the incentives and the visions of the people who are around your place, your land. Genius Loci is the spirit of the place. Deep down beneath the cultural layers, the social layers, the ecological layers, there is a undefined almost, and we're dealing now with a sort of different territory, different type of lens, the feel of a place. And we're going to delve into this. We're going to start with the sort of intuitive work that I did as my master's thesis when I was an architecture student, without fully knowing that I was going to discover permaculture And from permaculture, start my way into passive solar design. From that, studying my way onto sustainability, discovering systems thinking, and then regenerative design. I was much too young for all of this. But I had a vague clue about how important understanding the feel of a place was. And I also had a knack for philosophy and jargon and fancy words. And so I made a whole thesis on phenomenology of space, which is the way a place makes you feel. This is very sort of niche discussions, but there are a select few of us who actually do believe that good architecture makes you a better person. Good architecture can make you feel a certain way, and can make you connect with a place, with the spirits of that place, in a way that makes you become fuller, makes you experience life in a different way. All grand words, which were, as you can see, implemented in a vineyard project in the middle of nowhere, where I tried to take the culture, the spirit of that place, and make an interjection that would make sense to it.
So I have come to this place that Joe and I share, the ideas that Joe and I share from a different place regarding the energy part of it. I'm old enough to have gone to school in the late 70s, early 80s, so I was introduced to passive solar. But this other sense comes from my questioning of that Renaissance linear perspective is not real. It's a cultural biased system. This led me into exploring, discovering modern art and what I think is the essential element of modern art. Their goal was to create a language to better understand and analyze the natural world, or analyze a world outside of what our linear minds can think of. And particularly the Russian artist El Lissitzky, whose work heavily influenced my thinking. His paintings are called Prowns. Just a couple of points from his writings. The Prown was a process towards architecture, very much a meditative and nonlinear way of thinking about architecture. He thought of it as a project for the affirmation of the new, which, just growing out of an intuitive process. And some ideas from Lissitzky that I find really very powerful and a very important part of thinking about the canvas or a piece of paper is we have to free ourselves from the assumed perpendicular axis. The idea that we look at a piece of paper or we think about things from an assumed perpendicular axis is very much the basis of European linear perspective. And also the idea of canvas is infinite space. And he says, Prown has the power to create aim. So these are all, I think, really important ideas for us to consider when we're drawing, is to think about these things, not as limitations, but to understand the cultural biases that we bring to even how we start to think about something. So from this inspiration, I started a process in college, discovered a process of this meditative design analysis and form making. So these are two examples from my graduate school thesis of how to think about a row house in San Francisco. What is a house between two walls? So I have come to the same point with Joe about a language to listen and understand a place in a deeper, more intuitive way. Another example, Kandinsky, who is notable for the first European artist to do abstract art. So there was no subject. But for Kandinsky, color and shapes, he reveals the potential for using these abstract colors and shapes as ways of thinking about something. And so Kandinsky was a person who had a sense called synesthesia. So when he heard sound, he sensed color and vice versa. So this idea that colors and shapes and patterns can be used as a thinking tool. Kandinsky represents that symbols as thinking tools. This is a Chinese painting from 960, which has an abstract quality. Chinese landscape painting, it's often described as vague or conceptual, but that's in relationship to Western perspective. Chinese landscape painting has always been about these ephemeral sort of understanding nature in a deeper, more intuitive way. Again, another Chinese landscape painting that's wonderfully magical and abstract and meaningful. And then also a Monet painting, which is strikingly similar to the Chinese landscape painting. So Monet says, I'm following nature without being able to grasp her. I'm perhaps having become a painter to the flowers. So to me, this really embodies what we're talking about, finding tools to get us to think past what we think we already know.
We're going layers and layers and layers deeper. But there is an intuitive element to understanding a place that everyone has. Some, such as Ross Chapin, who's also an architect, you call it the beauty mind. This intuitive understanding, knowledge, a feel maybe of what beauty is, what fits in a place, what makes sense and what doesn't. Now, on top of all of these layers and so many others that we could add, there is a dimension to listening, the dimension of time, because a place isn't the place that you see in front of you from the scale of the cell, of the ant, of the leaf, of the tree, of the river, of the hill, of the ecoregion. But it is also all of these things in every slice of time, billions of years ago, up until its more recent history. And getting a feel or understanding for the geological history of a place, the cultural history of a place, brings such an enormous richness to a project. And again, we find inspiration in vernacular architecture because when we speak of time, we speak of understanding the rhythms of nature. And vernacular architecture is so in tune with the rhythms of nature. Here is an example from Indian architecture from the book Ritual House, which we highly recommend, of the daily migration in the summer from cooler daytime spaces to cooler nighttime spaces. There's sleeping on the roof where nighttime breezes keep you cool, but then in the day, sheltering in the lower, cooler parts of the house. And then the seasonal migration, another scale of rhythm from the summer places to the winter places, places that are naturally warmer in the winter. Other architects have tried to do this. And when you do not listen fully to nature, you can go a bit overboard. And here's an example of an architect trying to shade everything everywhere all at once.